Hi everyone, Hugh here from Puppet Things with a quick tutorial on putting together a foam puppet head. For this example, we're going to use our dino pattern available on the website, but this is going to work for most puppet heads that have one mouth and one dart, which is a kind of classic combination that you can make tons and tons of different shapes with. First things first, we're going to take our pattern and trace it onto our foam. I'm going to be using some orange foam just because why not? To cut it out, I'm going to be using my scroll saw, but you can do the same thing with a scalpel or even a pair of scissors. Just make sure you cut accurately to the line and make sure the sides are nice and flat, which is why I'm using a scroll saw, because it's easy to do that. Because reticulated foam is so squidgy, it can be super difficult to cut. So you want to make sure you have a very, very sharp or new blade in whatever you're cutting it with. And you hold the scalpel upright even as you go around a corner to make sure that your edges are super crisp and perpendicular to the sides. That way you can make sure it sticks together really, really neatly. And if you're doing it with scissors, it's the same thing. You want to make sure that as you cut, you're angling the blade perpendicular to the foam. Otherwise, you'll end up with a slightly off edge. And that can mean it's difficult for the foam to join together flat. It might be like this or like this, and that can interrupt the shape of the head. In general though, foam is very squidgy, so it's very forgiving with what you decide to do with it. And most patterns will work even if you cut it with a rusty old spoon, you know? Here are my two halves. I flipped the pattern so that the clean half is the same on both of them and on the outside. Otherwise we'll see the pen marks on the edge of the cut. And in this case, on this foam, it got a little bit dirty. So that's going to be on the inside and we'll have a nice bright orange outside. Now the best glue to use on reticulated foam or any kind of squidgy or flexible substrate is contact glue. Something like hot glue that dries hard that some people use in reticulated foam might stick it together, but it doesn't allow for that same level of flexibility. And because it dries hard on something soft, it's eventually going to crack off if you use it really heavily. So contact adhesive is the perfect solution for this. As long as it's flexible and can stretch, it's good on foam. So the way this stuff works is you apply a thin layer to either side of what you're putting together. In this case, we're going to put the darts of the head together first. These are the things that make the head round. And I like to keep it in the tube when I do this. For something like Plastizote or EVA foam, you can draw a line across whatever you're sticking together and then use a lolly stick or a piece of card or something to spread it. But because reticulated foam is so absorbent, it sucks in all the glue really quickly. So if you do that, you'll end up using tons and tons and tons of glue, which can dry a bit too hard and a bit too crunchy and is just wasteful. So you don't squeeze very hard and you keep it moving as you go across the seam. A tiny amount of glue is coming out at a time and you can control exactly where it goes without it squidging everywhere. I'm barely squeezing the tube at all, I'm just letting it fall out of the end. And because I'm moving the end of the tube so much, it only leaves behind a tiny, tiny amount of glue, which is perfect for what we need. The way this works is you let both sides dry. So while that's drying, I'm going to move on to the other one for maximum efficiency. So now the glue is tacky and dry on both sides, we're going to put it together. Now, what darts are meant to do in a pattern like this is round off the head. So as you're sticking them together, make sure that you're holding the foam so it wants to go round. You're not trying to stick them together flat. You can go nice and slow. The glue bonds immediately, so you want to make sure that when you put it together, there's no bits sticking up. What you want to avoid doing is pressing it this way, because while the glue is still slightly tacky, it's going to squish the foam and be an ugly like divot. So you just want to make sure that you're lightly pushing it together from both sides like this. So now our darts are stuck together, we're going to stick together the two halves of the head, which means putting glue on the bottom of the chin here and all around the top of the head and the back, and not putting any glue on the mouth because we don't want the mouth to stick to the mouth. Otherwise, there's no point having a mouth. Don't put any glue on the bottom here as well, because that's the neck hole. That's where your hand goes up into. So the glue is tacky, and we're going to stick it together. Making sure the edges line up, and then just very slowly going along, keeping the foam bent because that's the way it wants to be. You can even use your thumb on the outside edge to make sure that the two pieces of foam are really smooth when they go together. And again, for the most part, the foam is so squishy, and you can always just trim it with a pair of scissors afterwards, that you don't have to beat yourself up if your seam is a little bit bumpy. If you can't get your hand on either side of the seam, like if you're going around the head like this, I like to have one hand on the inside, and then on the outside, just pinch the edges together very, very softly to keep it nice and round. So my middle finger is pressing up against the back to make sure I don't squish it too much, and then just bringing the two edges together, using the two head darts as a kind of indicator where they might line up, and moving slowly down the head, making sure everything is super, super neat. This is the dino head pattern followed exactly, but if you have your own pattern or you want to adapt this pattern, now is the time to do it, because once it's like this, it's quite easy to change things without having to unstitch everything. So for example, if my hand was a little bit bigger and it didn't fit inside that hole very easily, I could take a pair of scissors or a scalpel and just widen that hole a little bit. So I would cut from here to here just to make it a slightly larger hole for my big fat hand. Or vice versa, if you found that actually it's too accommodating and you want to bring things in a bit, you can just cut around seams and bring them together again to make it even smaller. Sometimes if you want to make things a bit rounder, you can cut up the back of the seam and add a triangle of foam to kind of expand that area. So you do something like this, a little pie-shaped wedge, and you would cut up the back of that seam, stick it in on both sides, and then you would have a slightly rounder back of the head. Little tweaks like that are super easy to make when they're at this stage, but much more difficult to make once they're covered in fabric. So now we have our foam head sculpt done, the next thing to do is to put the mouth plate in, which I'm going to show you in the next video.